Sodocha na pozivu Filozofskog instituta. Thanks very much, Dr. Boršić, Dr. Karasman, for their kind invitation to give this talk today. And the topic of my paper, my presentation, is the practice of democracy according to Rousseau. But I will focus more specifically on the control of government action by the citizenry, that is, democracy understood as the way the people controls the action of their government. And in this respect, I will focus on the notion of legal insurrection, according to Rousseau, or even legalized revolutions. That is some way of, reacting to the abuse of power, not in a violent way, but according to legal procedures, which I think is very interesting aspect of Rousseau's theory. So I will now start. The idea of democracy in Rousseau's political thought is the focus of this presentation. I will begin by distinguishing two meanings of democracy in Rousseau's political writings. Democracy can be understood either as a specific form of government or as a fundamental characteristic of all legitimate political regimes. In the first sense, democracy is a system of self-government. Such a system is reserved for very small states or city-states. In the second sense, democracy is a characteristic of a true republic, because in any true republic, the citizens appoint the government and exercise constant control over its actions. In my presentation, I will develop the second meaning of the notion of democracy and try to make the following points. In his political writings, Rousseau is very careful not to encourage political violence, which he in fact condemns. However, a characteristic feature of Rousseau's conception of democracy is that it opens up the possibility of what might be called, as I said, legal insurrection or even revolution. To make this point, I will briefly refer to the social contract. However, I will deliberately leave aside the classical problems raised by the theory of the social contract. For example, I will not consider whether or not it is a contract in the proper sense of the word, whether it is a historical event or a pure idea of reason. I will focus on democracy in the broader sense and at the two aspects I just mentioned, the rejection of violence and the notion of legal insurrection or legalized revolution. To do so, I will also focus on texts that are often considered to be among Rousseau's lesser works, although they deserve careful attention. The Letters from the Mountain, les lettres écrites de la montagne, and the Considerations on the Government of Poland, les considérations sur le gouvernement de Poland. So my presentation will have three parts. First, the two meanings of democracy. Second, the case of Geneva. And third, the case of Poland. According to Rousseau, the body politic is constituted by a social contract. The formulation of the contract is very precise because it must reconcile security and liberty. The essential clause of the contract is that each citizen submits to the supreme direction of the general will, while the community as a whole commits itself to preserving the security and liberty of each citizen. Each for all and all for each is the essence of the social contract. There is an intrinsic link between political legitimacy and collective solidarity. The social contract establishes political body endowed with a will, the general will, expressed in the form of general laws. The citizens constitute a self-legislating political body. This is what Rousseau calls a republic. The task of enforcing the law falls to the government. More precisely, the government is charged by the people to make the decisions required by public affairs in accordance with the law. If we take the word people in the political sense, meaning a community of citizens, then the people are the sovereign, and the government is nothing more than the people's agent. When it is reversed, when this hierarchy between people and the government is reversed, when the people are subordinate to the government, then the social contract is broken. This is the way in which all states, according to Rousseau, are bound to decay and perish, through the progressive overturning of the hierarchy between the people and their government. In Rousseau's theory, democracy is one of the three forms of legitimate government. This is the first meaning. Provided they conform to the principle of popular sovereignty, monarchy and aristocracy are the two other forms. As we have seen, a republic is a community of self-legislating citizens. A democracy, on the other hand, is a system of self-government. The citizens constitute not only a self-legislating body, but also a self-governing body. This is the narrow meaning of the concept of democracy. It's a system in which the majority of citizens are directly involved in the administration of the state. It's a regime that requires very specific conditions and an extraordinary degree of civic virtue. That is why Rousseau says that a true democracy has never existed and will never exist in this first sense. However, what Rousseau calls a republic appears to be a democracy if we take the word democracy in a broader sense. Here, democracy is not just one of the three main political regimes. In a sense, all legitimate political regimes are also fundamentally democratic. There are two reasons for this. First, it is up to the people to decide what kind of regime, what kind of government they think is best for them. Second, the people also decide who should participate in the government, who should be a member of the government. The choice of a political regime is a matter of law, a general disposition, but the appointment of the government is not. It's a particular decision that concerns individuals. Consequently, the citizens are not content with expressing their will in the form of general laws. The citizens, as it were, rule over the rulers. Rousseau sees this as a consequence of the concept of sovereignty. For the task of the sovereign is not only to make laws, but also to control their enforcement. The sovereignty of the people implies that the citizens oversee the actions of their government. How should this happen? In the social contract, Rousseau states that citizen oversight of the government requires regular general assemblies, and in fact, ideally, each single year, the citizens should assemble and control what's happening, how the government is doing its job. So he means by general assemblies, he means assemblies of all citizens, not assemblies of representatives or deputies. Ideally, the citizens' assembly should meet every year and begin by answering two mandatory questions. The citizens should decide A, whether they want to keep the same political regime or not, and B, if they keep the same regime, whether they want the same rulers to remain in charge. The second question is familiar to us. It is the principle that rulers are elected and can be removed from office by the people. What we are less familiar with is the possibility of regime change, a possibility that remains open at all times. In a sense, this is a kind of legalized revolution, as I said. Citizens have the right to revolutionize the state administration whenever they deem it necessary. In this very peculiar sense, the right to revolution is inherent in the concept of popular sovereignty. At the same time, however, the democratic control of the government and its possible sanction, the transformation of the entire state administration, must be carried out in a highly legalized manner. First, as we have seen, there must be regular assemblies in which all citizens participate, all citizens, not just a fraction of the citizenry. Second, these general assemblies must be held on fixed dates, and this is a very important point. Fixed dates, so that, and this is the first quote on my handout, I quote, so that on a proper day the people is legitimately called together by law without need of any formal summoning. This is a very important point. The people assemble according to a legal procedure, not at the initiative of certain individuals. This is the second quote, I quote, apart from these assemblies authorized by their date alone, every assembly of the people not summoned in accordance with the prescribed forms should be regarded as unlawful, and all its acts are null and void, because the command to assemble should itself proceed from the law, unquote. To put it plainly, popular assemblies can be exploited in many ways. One way to exploit these assemblies is for an individual or a group of individuals to manipulate the date, to manipulate the place of the assembly, and to manipulate the agenda of the assembly. And this is what Rousseau wants to prevent. Therefore, the command to assemble must be as impersonal as the general will itself. And what I'm aiming at here is to point out that Rousseau is trying to apply the principle of generalization, not only to the making of the laws, but also to the control of the government. This is the main point. The command to assemble must come from a mere fact, namely the date on which it has been decided that regular meetings must be held. And now I turn to the application of these general principles to the case of Geneva and then to the case of Poland. So this is my second part, the case of Geneva. And I will now examine how Rousseau applies these principles when he has to deal with specific historical and practical situations. And I will take these two examples, the example of Geneva, which was a more or less independent republic at the end of the 18th century, and the example of Poland just before the first partition of the country in 1772. What is important about Geneva? Rousseau became involved in Geneva politics after the authorities of the Republic condemned Émile and the social contract in 1762. The condemnation of Rousseau's writings by the authorities of the Geneva Republic, this condemnation of Rousseau's writings was not only philosophically controversial, but in many ways illegal. As you know, Rousseau was a citizen of Geneva. It was in many ways illegal. Rousseau was still a citizen of the Republic of Geneva, and the formal procedures required to condemn the citizen had not been followed. Initially, however, Rousseau's condemnation provoked little reaction from his fellow citizens. As a result, Rousseau renounced his citizenship in May 1763. His decision came as a shock to the citizens of Geneva, who then asked him to intervene in the public affairs of the Republic, not only to defend his own cause, but also to combat the despotism of the authorities. More precisely, one of the main ideologues of the ruling class, Jean-Robert Tronchin, published in September and October 1763 a book entitled Letters Written from the Countryside, Lettres écrites de la campagne, in which he presented strong arguments in favor of the rights and privileges of the same ruling class. In response to this book, Rousseau wrote his Letters Written from the Mountain, Lettres écrites de la montagne, a book he completed in 1764. Elections were to be held in Geneva in January 1765, and Rousseau had promised to publish his book before the elections. He kept his word, and the book came out in December 1764. So now let's take a closer look at the situation. First, the development of the Republic of Geneva illustrates the process described in the social contract. Originally, the citizens were gathered in an assembly called the General Council, which appointed 4 magistrates or syndics for the management of public affairs. These magistrates were assisted by councillors who formed the small council. Gradually, however, the small council usurped power. Instead of advising the syndics in charge of public affairs, instead of advising the syndics who were elected by the Citizens' General Council, the small council gradually came to see itself as the true government of the Republic and the source of all legitimate power. The syndics were still elected by the General Council, but from among candidates chosen by the small council. From a historical perspective, Geneva was thus transformed into an oligarchy, and in fact the dominance of the small council over the General Council corresponded to the social dominance of a minority of wealthy families over the majority of citizens. The history of Geneva thus illustrates the process of state degeneration described in the social contract. Instead of being subordinate to the sovereign, that is, to the people, the government usurps the sovereignty of the people. This is a violation of the social contract. So, what happens when the social contract? In such case, the citizens are no longer obligated to obey the government. If they still submit to the government's decision, it is out of fear and mere coercion. Consequently, if they are strong enough to resist such coercion, there is no law forbidding them to do so, because there is no longer a legal order, but only a pretense of legal order. So, what is Rousseau's advice to his fellow citizens, or former fellow citizens? Interestingly, Rousseau is very careful not to encourage them to engage in political violence. There are 2 reasons for this. First, Rousseau condemns the use of violence in politics. Basically, his idea is that whatever good may be achieved by violent means, the good will always be outweighed by the evil that will also result. Once violence is unleashed, there is always more evil than good to be expected. Second, there is a more circumstantial reason. Rousseau believes that in the case of Geneva, a violent uprising would have counterproductive effects. The use of force would lend an appearance of legitimacy to the use of force by the small council, to the suppression of the uprising. The use of force would lend an appearance of legitimacy to the use of force by the small council, thereby reinforcing its claim to be the guardian of the public interest. Under such conditions, what course of action does Rousseau recommend? At this point, we need to consider even more closely the historical situation of Geneva. At the beginning of the 18th century, the opposition between the rich and the poor between the oligarchs and the citizens had grown stronger and led to a major political crisis. The solution to the crisis was mediated by France and the republics of Bern and Zurich, that is, two other Swiss republics. The measures agreed upon to resolve the crisis were set forth in 1738 in a document called the Settlement of the Mediation, which I will hereafter refer to simply as the settlement. Now, it is interesting to note that Rousseau, in his Letters from the Mountain, attempts to restore the balance of political power through a careful interpretation of this document. In essence, Rousseau considers the settlement to be the fundamental law of the Republic. The settlement, Rousseau argues, was not imposed on the citizens, but rather agreed to by them. Consequently, the articles of the settlement must be considered the articles of the fundamental law of the Republic. The settlement is, so to speak, the constitution of the Geneva Republic. On this basis, Rousseau's strategy is to enable the development of a public opinion that would put pressure on the small council and favor a reverse evolution, that is, a retrogression from the present despotism to the republican spirit that Rousseau claims was the original spirit of the Geneva institutions. In this view, the key factor is the interpretation of the fundamental law, that is, of the settlement. At this point, political action is intimately linked to legal hermeneutics. I don't want to go into the details, so I will just make 2 or 3 points. First, the settlement of 1738 stated that the Republic of Geneva consisted of 5 different bodies: the General Council, the Small Council, the Syndics, and 2 other councils of lesser importance. 2 consequences followed. First, Article 3 of the settlement defined the powers of the General Council. The powers of the General Council, that is, of the Assembly of Citizens, were precisely defined and enumerated. Second, the settlement sought to achieve a certain balance between the so-called constituent bodies of the Republic, so a balance of power between the people and the government. And this is what Rousseau finds unacceptable. There is no question of a balance of power between the citizens and the government. The government must be subordinated to the people, that is, to the citizens. So in this view, the power of the small council was to be balanced by the fact that the syndics had to be elected by the General Council. And another feature of the settlement designed to counterbalance the power of the small council was the right of citizens to appeal decisions of the small council if they felt they were unjust or unconstitutional. This is another point that is important, the possibility to protest the actions of the government through what is called the right of remonstrance, in French, the droit de représentation, right of remonstrance toward the small council. This right means that a certain number of citizens were entitled to submit formal complaints to the small council. In fact, none of these provisions were effective. As for the elections, the small council named the candidates among whom the citizens had to choose. In other words, the citizens had to choose among candidates who shared the same ideology and belonged to the same ruling class. As a result, the elections were a mere insignificant formality. As for specific remonstrances, it was the prerogative of the small council to decide whether the complaint was legitimate or not. In case of conflict between the citizens and their so-called government, between the general and the small council, the latter was both judge and party. The balance was thus only apparent, but the main flaw in the regime, according to Rousseau, is the very idea of a balance between different constituent bodies. It is the idea, to put it in contemporary terms, it is the idea of checks and balances. For in Rousseau's view, the state is not composed of several particular bodies, of which the people is one. On the contrary, the people are the state, and all the particular bodies are subordinate to the will of the people, that is, to the general will. Consequently, Rousseau's idea is not to establish a balance of power between the legislative and executive branches. Rousseau's core idea is to establish a clear hierarchy between the people and the government. The General Assembly of the people has absolute sovereign power. This power cannot be determined, that is limited, as was the case in Article 3 of the Constitution. Now comes the most interesting part. In many ways, the settlement does not conform to the principle of the social contract. Instead of rejecting it, however, Rousseau considers it the proper basis for further political action. For all its flaws, the settlement is fundamental law. The alternative to the settlement is a return to violence, and Rousseau advises his fellow citizens not to go down that road. But Rousseau also insists that the settlement must be taken as a whole. The text of the settlement must be read with a view to the consistency of its articles, that is, the consistency of a text that is fundamental law. Now, there is another article in the settlement, Article 44, which says that the General Council has the right to make any future changes to the settlement that may be necessary. As Rousseau reads it, this article gives the General Council the power to change the fundamental law of the Republic. Thus, there is a discrepancy between Article 3 and Article 44. In Article 3, the fundamental law limits the power of the General Council, whereas in Article 44, the General Council is given unlimited power to amend the fundamental law. Rousseau solves the problem by saying that the limitations on the power of the General Council in Article 3 are only temporary and can be removed by the General Council itself according to Article 44. Here Rousseau uses two principles of interpretation, the social contract and the idea that the fundamental law must be a coherent body of legal norms. He reads the settlement of 1738 to be consistent with his own conception of the social contract. In doing so, he not only restores the sovereignty of the people, but also salvages the coherence of the norm. And indeed, Rousseau's interpretation is consistent with the doctrine of the social contract, and in particular, it is consistent with the idea that the Assembly of Citizens has the right, if necessary, not only to dismiss the government, but also to change the political regime, that is, to change the constitution. This opens up the possibility of decisive radical action on the part of the citizens. However, Rousseau does not advocate such a radical revolutionary step. A complete change of political regime would not be possible without violence, and violence is to be avoided, not only for reasons of principle, but also, as we have seen, for political strategic reasons. Therefore, Rousseau advocates what appears to be a minor change in the articles of the settlement. He does not advocate changing any of the existing articles. He recommends adding a single article to the text of the settlement. And here is a very important point, how to apply the principle of generalization to mass protest. Not only to the making of the laws, but to mass protest. And this is the point that Rousseau is making in proposing the addition of an article to the settlement. This addition to the settlement consists of the organization of the remonstrances of the protest. The aim is to give them a large popular base. In the first place, the citizens were to assemble by companies in the military sense. The army of the Republic of Geneva was an army of citizens organized in 4 regiments corresponding to the 4 main sections of the city. The 4 regiments were subdivided into companies. Rousseau recommends using the division of citizens into companies to hold popular consultations. He probably had in mind the Roman system of the centuriate assembly, the Comitia Centuriata. And second, if a majority of the citizens, that is, a majority of the companies, were to approve the remonstrance, the protest, the small council would either revise its decision or convene the general council, which will then make the final decision. In other words, Rousseau wants to institutionalize and legalize a process of mass protest. He wants to make sure that a majority of citizens weigh on the legitimacy of the protest. If the majority of citizens joined the protest, the small council would either have to reconsider its position or convene the major council and let the people make the final decision. So the point is here is that there is always a problem in a mass protest because it can be manipulated by what Rousseau calls a faction, a minority of people organizing the mass protest and manipulating it. So Rousseau wants to make sure that a mass protest is really the expression of the generality of the citizenry. And the way he imagined it is a procedure in which all the citizens assembled not as a legislative body, but in the framework of the military organization of the whole city, the citizens would say whether they join or not the protest. And this would give, this process of generalization of the protest would give legitimacy to this protest. And then the rulers would have to take this into account. So the main point here is Rousseau is always afraid that a protest, whatever it is, could be the expression of only a fraction of the citizenry. That's the point. And now I will finish with the case of Poland. The situation of Poland is the opposite of that of Geneva. In Geneva, the executive power is too strong. In Poland, it is too weak. More precisely, the case of Geneva illustrates the typical process by which, according to the social contract, the hierarchy between the people and the government is gradually reversed, while Poland is an exception to this process. Our quotes, this is my third quote on the handout. Legislation was brought low in Poland in a way that is quite unusual and perhaps unique. It lost its rigor without being subjugated by the executive power. End of quote. However, there is another aspect that contributes to the contrast between the situation in Geneva and that in Poland. In Geneva, foreign powers intervened to mediate the conflict between the ruling oligarchy and the citizens, while in Poland, foreign powers used Poland's internal divisions to dismantle the Polish state. So let's take a closer look at the situation in Poland. There were several reasons for the weakness of the Polish state. At that time, Poland consisted of several provinces which were represented in the Diet, that is, in the Polish Assembly of Representatives. Since Poland was not a hereditary monarchy, the king was elected. This opened the way for foreign powers to favor their own candidate when a king had to be elected. For example, the King of Poland, at the time of the writing of the Considerations on the Government of Poland, was Stanislas II Augustus, a protégé of Catherine of Russia. In such a context, the Diet played an important role. However, the entire functioning of the Polish state could be paralyzed by the use of the so-called liberum veto. The liberum veto meant that any representative in the Diet had the right to veto any bill. When such a veto occurred, the bill was rejected. But more than that, when a veto occurred, the Diet itself was dismissed and the previous proceedings were annulled. In a word, while in Geneva the problem arises from the growing despotism of the ruling oligarchy, in Poland the problem arises from a situation of institutional anarchy. As a result, the Polish state is incapable of taking decisive action, which makes it unable to resist the ambitions of neighboring countries. Obviously, the anarchy of the Polish state was in the interest of Poland's powerful neighbors, especially Russia. And Poland's neighbors, while claiming to help the country solve its internal problems, in fact did their best to exacerbate this state of anarchy. This led to the first partition of Poland in 1772, followed by two more partitions in 1793 and 1795 between Russia, Prussia and Austria. After 1795 and until 1918, that is after the end of the First World War, the Polish state ceased to exist. Now there is another feature in the Polish political process that deserves attention. It is the existence of so-called confederations. Confederations were spontaneous associations formed in the provinces of Poland, either to redress abuses of power by the king or to act in place of the executive when it proved incapable of acting. Confederations took the form of armed rebellions organized by the nobility or certain cities. They originated in a particular province, but could expand into general confederations uniting several provinces. And here again we will find the process of generalization of the protest from one protest in a province, one confederation forming in a province, to all the provinces of Poland. This is what Rousseau will have in mind. These confederations had leaders and councils. They proclaimed their aims and could be recognized a posteriori by the king. To a certain extent, the confederations were a means of overcoming the deadlocks caused by the use of the liberum veto, that is, by the paralysis of the state institutions. From 1768 to 1772, a confederation was formed at the Bar Fortress, la Confédération de Bar, to defend the independence of Poland against the Russian threats and interference in Polish affairs. Along with other European writers, Rousseau was asked by the Confederates to assess the situation in Poland and to make recommendations for the reform of the Polish state. Again, Rousseau took his task very seriously, and the result of his reflections are the considerations on the government of Poland. So, what are Rousseau's recommendations in this case? Roughly speaking, Rousseau recommends A. Establishing a coherent system of public education with the aim of building a sense of national identity. B. Reforming the entire administration with the aim of making the Polish aristocratic state more republican. And C. Maintaining the principle of confederations. It would be interesting to consider each of these 3 points, but I will say only a few words about the first aspect and concentrate on the last, that is, on the confederations. As we have seen at the time of writing, foreign powers were constantly interfering in Polish affairs. The main threat came from Russia, which seemed to be preparing to invade the country. Therefore, Rousseau's intention in writing his considerations was to help Poland survive as an autonomous polity. For this reason, Rousseau places a strong emphasis on the notion of national identity. The considerations make a very strong case for the development of a public education system aimed at building patriotism and national pride. Although Rousseau touches on military matters at the end of the considerations, his idea is that the Poles might not be able to resist the military power of Russia. In a word, Rousseau clearly recognizes the prospect of Poland being invaded by Russia. In this view, his recommendation is to develop a strong cultural identity that will make it possible to Russia, that will make it impossible for Russia to assimilate Poland into its own empire. Rousseau makes this point very forcefully. Unfortunately, I have here a quote that is not on the handout, but here it goes. Speaking of Poland's neighbors, he says, Rousseau, I quote, "You cannot possibly keep them from swallowing you. See to it at least that they shall not be able to digest you. See to it that every Pole is incapable of becoming a Russian, and I answer for it that Russia will never subjugate Poland." End of quote. As for the confederations, many foreign powers thought that they were a hotbed of anarchy. They therefore, foreign observers, recommended that the confederation be outlawed. Interestingly, Rousseau advises just the opposite. He advises to keep the principle of this kind of mass protests that are the confederation. Here is what he says, and I quote, this is the last quote in my handout. "The confederations are the butler, the refuge, the sanctuary of your constitution. So long as the confederations remain alive, the constitution cannot, I believe, destroy itself. You must retain them, but you must also lay down rules for them. Instead of abolishing the confederations, then define the situations in which they may legitimately take place. Then lay down clear rules regarding their form and function, so as to give them legal sanction. There are, I should say, situations whose mere existence calls for the instant confederation of all Poland. For example, when the troops of a foreign power, of whatever pretext, set foot on Polish soil, whenever the Diet is prevented from assembling on the day fixed by law, whenever troops have been stationed at its meeting place when it is to convene, whenever the Diet structure is changed or its deliberations suspended or its freedom curtailed in any way, in all these cases, a nationwide confederation should come into existence as a matter of course. A nationwide confederation should come into existence as a matter of fact, And now I conclude. In the case of Poland, as in the case of Geneva, Rousseau's goal seems to be to stop, or at least to slow down the process of state degeneration. More than that, Rousseau's goal seems to be to reverse the historical trend. In the case of Geneva, his final gift to his fellow citizens, as he took his final farewell from his native city, was to provide them with an interpretation of their constitution that would enable them to counteract the progress of arbitrary rule. And here the main point is legal hermeneutics, to give citizens the means to counteract any abuse of power. So some kind of legal culture is needed for citizens to be able to organize their protests. In the case of Poland, Rousseau reinterprets the traditional historical institutions of the state in a way that makes room for legal insurrections, legalized insurrections. The remonstrances in the case of Geneva and the confederations in the case of Poland are instances of popular movements that either counteract the arbitrary rule of the government or take charge of the general interest when the government proves incapable of acting. In both cases, however, the protest, insurrection, or even legal revolution must take place in such a way that A, the movement is general, that is, extends to the entire population, B, it proceeds according to a legalized procedure, that is, develops in a way that is accepted by the entire citizenry. This is why Rousseau insists on the role of mere facts, as we have just seen. In the social contract, the General Assemblies must meet on the dates fixed by law. In the consideration of the government of Poland, the use of military force against the Assembly authorizes and legalizes the general insurrection. What gives legitimacy to legal insurrections, popular protests, civil movements, is that a large number of citizens participate in them. Such a large number of citizens may be assumed to represent the citizenry as a whole, but it's only an assumption. That is why protest movements, as in the case of Geneva, or legal insurrections, as in the case of Poland, must, according to certain procedures, extend to the entire citizenry, and not to a certain number of citizens. What gives legitimacy to the movement is its generalization. It is also the fact that it develops according to procedures enshrined in the fundamental law. The conclusion is therefore twofold. On the one hand, it means that protest movements, legal insurrections, or even institutional revolutions must conform to legal constraints. In other words, their goals and methods must be accepted and supported by the general will. On the other hand, there must be a component of radical democracy in any republican constitution. Without this, there is no true democracy, and without this component of radical democracy, there is no true republic. Thank you.